Good morning. We are now on the video record. Today is Tuesday, the 10th day of July, 2018. The time is 9:09 a.m. We are here at 871 Venetia Bay Boulevard, Venice, Florida, for the purpose of taking the video deposition of Julio Gonzalez, taken by the plaintiff in the case of Ruth Green as personal representative versus Tracy Ng-D-O et al. Defendants. The court reporter is Lisa Rollins. The videographer is Mary Scott. Would all counsel please state their appearance for the record?
George Williamson on behalf of the plaintiff.
Marjorie Chalfant on behalf of OCV.
Dan Shapiro on behalf of Dr. Ng.
Would the court reporter please swear the witness?
Raise your right hand and be sworn, please. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Good morning, doctor. Please state your name for the record.
My name is Julio Gonzalez.
Dr. Gonzalez, have you ever given a deposition before?
Yes, sir, I have.
In what case did you give a deposition?
I do not recall specific cases, but I've given them in multiple cases.
Okay. What types of cases were those?
To the best of my recollection, every case on which I have given a deposition has been a medical malpractice case.
Okay. And were these cases that were filed against you personally?
Only one case was filed against me, and I don't recall whether I gave a deposition on that case or not.
Okay. The other cases that you're referencing, are those cases that you were called as a witness?
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to ask you if you know the capacity of what your witness testimony was, whether it was a fact witness or as an expert witness. If you don't know the answer to that, that's fine.
I'm waiting for the question.
So the question is, were you called as a fact witness or an expert witness?
I have been called in both capacities on different cases.
As a fact witness or an expert witness?
Either as a fact witness or as an expert witness on different cases, depending on the case.
Okay. And how many different cases are we talking about?
I don't recall how many.
Okay. More than 10?
Probably more than 10, yes, sir.
Okay. More than 15?
I don't know.
Okay. Less than 20?
I don't know. Don't know.
100?
Less than 100.
Okay. 50?
Less than 50.
Okay. So somewhere between 10 and 50.
Closer to 10 than 50, but yes,
Okay.
somewhere between 10 and 50.
And in the cases that you were called as an expert witness, who retained you as an expert witness? Was it the plaintiff or the defendant?
I don't recall that information.
Okay. Have you been called by both, have you been retained by both plaintiff's counsel as well as defense counsel?
I think there was a case where I was retained as an expert witness for a plaintiff. I don't know whether that case, whether I got deposed on that case. But that's the only case that I can recall off the top of my head where I would have been, where I was not a fact witness, and I would have been retained as an expert witness for one side or the other.
Okay. And was it Ms. Chalfant that retained you in that case?
I don't think I have ever been retained by Ms. Chalfant as a witness, except for, well, she's my company's attorney, so I guess I haven't, even in this case, been retained by Ms. Chalfant.
Okay. But safe to say that you're very familiar with the rules of a deposition?
I could always use a refresher.
Okay. Today we have a court reporter here.
Yes, sir.
She's taking down everything that we say. So it's important that we give verbal answers to questions, okay? So if I ask you a question, it's a yes or no question. Instead of saying uh-huh or nodding your head, it's important to say yes or no and to verbalize a response.
Thank you.
Today you're under oath, just the same as if you're in front of a judge. So you have the duty to tell the truth today. If at any point today I ask a question and you don't understand it, just ask me to rephrase it or ask it in a different way. I'm happy to do that. Sometimes I ask bad questions. If you answer one of my questions, I'm going to assume that you understood my question. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
If at any point today you need to take a break, just let me know. Happy to go off record and let you do what you need to do. If you need to make a call, that's fine. I understand. If I'm in the middle of asking you a question or a certain line of questions, I might ask that we finish those questions before you take a break, okay?
Yes, sir.
I want to briefly go off the record to get your cell phone number.
Go ahead and throw it because the time's 9:14 a.m. We're back on the record. The time is 9:16 a.m.
For the record, when we were off, we had a discussion about whether or not Dr. Gonzalez would provide his cell phone number. Counsel has instructed him to refuse to provide it, and Dr. Gonzalez, for the record, you are refusing to provide your cell phone number off the record.
Well, let me clarify this.
Yes.
What I said was, if you have a need for his phone number, tell us what it is. If you have records for Dr. Gonzalez that you want to find out if his phone number is in those text messages, show it to him and he can see if his phone number is there. If it's not there, you don't need to have the number.
Fair enough, Marjorie. We'll get to it later. Doctor, I'm going to ask you a question. If you agree with my question, just let me know. If you disagree, you can also let me know, okay? The notes that you create, your medical notes and reports, are accurate. You agree with that?
Generally, yes, I agree with that.
Okay. And what do you mean generally?
Well, there are every record-keeping system, regardless of how careful anyone may be, may have errors from transcription. It may have errors in recollection. It may have typographical errors. But generally, and I can speak now in particular for myself, I take great pains to make sure that the records that I create reflect my opinions on the case. I'll tell you one other thing. I don't go, I do not have the time. It is impossible for me to read every record I produce, every medical record that I produce, to ascertain 100% accuracy. So for those reasons, among others, I would say, yeah, generally they're accurate, but there is room for error and some discrepancy.
Fair to say you don't put anything in a medical note or report that is not true?
I don't put anything in the medical record that I believe not to be true.
Would you include all the information that you consider to be important about a patient's treatment in the medical record or no?
Generally, except that sometimes the absence of a piece of information may be relevant in its absence, but I may not actually affirmatively put that on the chart because generally doing that for every piece of information that may be relevant that is absent would be overwhelming.
Would you agree that a doctor should not treat a patient unless the doctor possesses the skill to treat that patient?
That is correct. That is correct, but I would narrow it down in the capacity for which the doctor is seeing that patient.
Would you agree that a doctor should always put the patient's interests first?
That's too general a question.
Would you agree that a doctor's number one goal is patient safety?
I would agree that a doctor's number one goal is to take care of the patient to the best of his or her abilities.
And you would never do anything to intentionally jeopardize a patient's safety?
I would not do anything to yes, that is correct.
Would you agree with me, doctor, that an open fracture occurs when a broken bone is exposed through the skin?
Yes.
And that can mean that the bone is actually sticking out of the skin, correct?
That is correct.
But it can also mean that the skin and soft tissue are disrupted, exposing a path to the site of the fracture, correct?
Object to the form of the question.
I would clarify by saying where there is a direct communication between the bone and the surrounding environment outside of the body.
Would you agree that an open fraction is a dangerous condition?
Define dangerous.
Is it a condition that poses a risk to a patient's health?
Yes.
Would you agree that it's important to treat an open fracture as soon as possible?
Yes.
If left untreated, would you agree that an open fracture can lead to infection and, in some cases, death?
Yes.
All right, doctor. If you could briefly provide me a summary of your education for the record.
Which education?
Well, let's start with your medical degree.
Okay. I graduated from high school. At that point, my intent was to become a physician. I went on to the University of Miami between the years of 1982 and 1986, where I studied pre-med, got a major in biology and a minor in chemistry. From there, I went to the University of Miami School of Medicine, where I studied medicine from 1986 to 1990. That is where I got my medical degree from the University of Miami School of Medicine. Then from there, I went and did an internal medicine internship at Portsmouth Naval Hospital. At that point, after finishing my internal medicine internship, I then went on to proceed to Pensacola Naval Air Station, where I gained training in naval aerospace medicine and was trained to become a flight surgeon. At that point, my training was interrupted, where I served the fleet until 1995, and then returned to continue my training, where I did my training in general surgery at University Medical Center in Jacksonville, Florida, and then from there, subsequent to that, my orthopedics training. When I started my orthopedics training, the program was part of the University Medical Center's program. It was not associated or affiliated with the University of Florida. However, towards the end of the program became affiliated with the University of Florida. So when I finished my degree, my residency completion reads University of Florida. From there, I went to Orlando, and I believe the year on that was 2000, where I did 3/4 of a fellowship in medicine, knee and reconstructive surgery. Tragically, my mentor died 3/4 into the fellowship, and at that point, I decided that it would probably be best for me to proceed to enter private practice. So that is my training as a medical physician.
Okay, and just to unpack that a little bit, why did you choose to go from medical school into the Navy?
I realized that paying for medical school was going to be an incredible hardship for my family. I was offered the opportunity to receive a scholarship to have my medical school paid for by the United States Naval Reserve. So I applied for the scholarship, got it, and part of the commitment was that you would pay back 4 years of active duty service. And at the end of my internal medicine internship, I was having difficulty deciding whether I really wanted to go into cardiology, which was my initial intent, and thought that the best way for me to explore that further was to go ahead and serve the fleet. which I did for 4 years. That was the interruption in my training. During that time, I decided that orthopedics was my calling.
And just so I'm clear, you served the 4 years in the Navy and then you left the Navy.
Well, technically, it was 9 years because as a reservist, they count the time that you were not in active duty as service time in the service. So technically, I think it was 9 years. But yes, to answer your questions, I think there was 4.5 or 5 years where I served active duty between the end of my internal medicine internship, which I completed through the Navy, and the start of my general surgery internship that I underwent in pursuit of my orthopedics training.
And when you leave the Navy, do you receive a discharge?
You get a letter of separation is what they call it for officers. I can't recall off the top of my head, but enlisted, I think, get separated. Officers get a letter of separation.
Okay. What was your rank when you left the Navy?
I was lieutenant.
Did that rank ever change?
I started off as an ensign, and then subsequently, upon completing medical school, got promoted to lieutenant. I got deep selected to lieutenant commander, but never took the oath because the timing was such that that the opportunity arose for me to pursue my civilian training rather than continue active duty. So I never took the oath as a lieutenant commander.
And then let's talk about your fellowship in Orlando. Who was your fellowship with?
It was with Jewett Orthopedics, and sadly, I can't remember the name of the initial mentor and the wonderful man who passed away in an airplane crash. But the fellowship was continued by Dr. Joe Billings. So at the time that I left, technically I was under Dr. Joe Billings' mentorship.
Okay, and you mentioned that you said you completed 3/4 of that. Is that 3 out of 4 years, or how does that work?
Yes, it was intended to be a 1-year fellowship, and I think I started in July or August, and I left prematurely because of the circumstances that I told you in April.
And when you left your fellowship training, you went to private practice, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And where was that private practice located?
It was located in Orlando, Florida.
Do you know the name of the group that you practice with?
Yes, sir. Baker, Hurd, Osteen, and Davenport. And I think for a while it was known as Baker, Hurd, Osteen, Davenport, and Gonzalez before I left Orlando to Venice.
Okay. And why did you, well, strike that. How long were you in Orlando?
I was in Orlando, I believe, for about 3 years, 3 to 4 years.
And were you employed when you finished your fellowship? Were you always employed with Baker, Hard, Osteen, Davenport?
Hurd, H-E-A-R-D. After my fellowship, I was always employed by Baker Hurd while in Orlando. Yes, sir.
And why did you leave Baker Hurd?
It was a personal decision that had to do with my family's lifestyle, specifically without getting into it because I don't see how it would be relevant in any way, but I will say that it was a preference made to me by my wife on her practice and her expectations on what her practice should be like. And so at that point, she's a gynecologist. At that point, she was a gynecologist and obstetrician. And so at that point, when we had that conversation, we decided that it was probably best for us to leave the area. And so I told her that I would find somewhere close to the water because having been born and raised in Miami, I missed the ocean very much. And pretty much the next day, literally the next day, we got word that there was a practice available in somewhere in Southwest Florida that was on the water. And as fate would have it, I ended up in Venice. And that was 2004.
And were you ever accused of malpractice when you worked for Baker Hurd?
Object to the form and relevance.
You can answer.
There was a lawsuit against me. I don't know if I was accused, but yeah, a lawsuit was filed against me on a medical malpractice case that I think took place. The events took place in 2002, or maybe 2003, while under the employ of Baker Hurd, Osteen, and Davenport.
And what were the general facts surrounding that lawsuit?
Same objection, Mr. Relevance.
It was a wrongful death case of a death that took place less than 24 hours after an arthroscopy, a shoulder arthroscopy.
And do you know what the final disposition of that case was?
That case was settled, much to my chagrin.
Did you have insurance defense counsel at the time that case was resolved?
Object to the form of the question. I don't know why we're even going here. He's not a defendant, and he's a treating physician.
Again,
I'm just letting you
objection
know,
to the
this
form,
is
I understand
completely off the track. So go ahead and ask your question, but
were you represented by insurance defense counsel at the time that case was resolved?
same objection.
I was insured. I had medical malpractice insurance, and the medical malpractice company found an attorney to represent me, if that is what you mean.
Yes. So in 2004, you left Orlando for Venice, Florida, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you purchased the practice in Venice, Florida?
Yes, sir.
Who was the doctor that you purchased the practice from, or the group?
The doctor's name is Dr. Fred Miller. Dr. Fred Miller. And that was his solo practice.
And that practice became, after you purchased it, Orthopedic Center of Venice, correct?
You know, actually, I think legally, thank you. I don't exactly remember what I purchased from Dr. Fred Miller because Orthopedic Center of Venice came into creation at that time. So technically, I guess it wasn't a purchase, but a direct purchase because I did not take over his corporation. So I'm not really sure. I would have to go back and study the legal nuances of how the transaction took place. But essentially, I inherited his patients, I inherited his phone number, I inherited his office. I agreed to take on his lease, and there was a very small amount of money paid to him in consideration for the contract.
And was that office in the same location that you're currently at now?
No, sir.
Okay, tell me about that.
The location of the practice at that time was 600 Nokomis Avenue South. My practice right now is in 241 Nokomis Avenue South. We were paying rent for that location. There is a building, 241 Nokomis Avenue, that became available. Bear in mind that my wife and I inhabited the same space. She ran her practice in a hallway. I ran my practice in an adjoining hallway with separate lobbies, but we shared the administrative space. There was a building that became available that was up for sale that was formerly a medical office that could easily be converted to have that same footprint. And we decided that it made more economic sense for us to purchase that building. And so that building was purchased under a corporation called Aragon. And I think it's Aragon PLLC, I think is the official name of the corporation. But nevertheless, the building is that where we practice right now, where Dr. Gonzalez, practice right now, and then in an adjoining hallway, or in a separate hallway with a separate lobby, Dr. Arabit, Gina Arabit, GINAARABITG, where my wife practices under Gynecology of Venice, is a building owned, although the same building, it is a building owned by Aragon PLLC. And Aragon PLLC is owned by my wife and I.
Doctor, you are also an attorney, correct?
Yes, sir.
In good standing with the Florida Bar, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you give me a brief background on your legal education?
I decided to go to law school as a result of my concerns regarding healthcare. I had written a book on federal healthcare policy, and this was in 2008 and 2009 when I wrote, or 2009 and 2010 when I wrote the book. And at the end of that effort, knowing that I didn't really understand the nuances of the laws affecting the medical industry and my profession, namely the medical profession, I decided that I would pursue a law degree in order to understand these issues better and perhaps advocate more effectively. So in 2010, I went to Stetson, where I completed my legal education in 2013. I became barred, or got admitted to the Florida Bar in February of 2014.
Your program at Stetson, was that like a full-time program?
No, I did the evening program, so I would practice medicine. I would see my patients during the day, and then at around 4 p.m. I would travel over to Tampa or Gulfport and do my classes.
Okay, did you graduate with any honors?
Yes, sir, I graduated with honors. Also got a Florida Constitutional Law Award and a advocacy award from the university as well.
And have you ever, since you've graduated from law school, have you ever practiced law?
I did my best to attempt to practice. I actually joined partnership with John Ferrari, who was a fellow student at Stetson, and we both live in South Sarasota County. And so we thought it would make sense for me to help him establish a practice with concentration on elder law and probate law, and my intent was at that time to build a separate healthcare law arm of that practice. Unfortunately, there's only 24 hours in the day. And at the same time, I had the opportunity to run for state representative, and so unfortunately I was never able to build that. I think I tried it for about a year and a half, and then withdrew from his practice.
Okay. And I think you mentioned what the goal was, but what types of cases did you work on in that year and a half?
I did not work on any cases for hire. I think I represented my wife in a medical malpractice case that eventually got dropped for procedural problems. And as you know, it was my intent to represent my practice, Orthopedic Center of Venice, in this case. But with the congressional race, I realized that I did not have the time to be able to do that.
And going back to Orthopedic Center of Venice, I want to talk about that for a little bit. You are the sole owner of Orthopedic Center of Venice, correct?
Yes, sir.
You are the sole officer, correct?
Define officer.
Well, you are the managing member of Orthopedic Center of Venice, correct?
That is correct.
There are no other individuals who participate in the corporate goings-on of Orthopedic Center of Venice, correct?
In the corporate goings-on.
As far as the structure of Orthopedic Center of Venice, there's no other individuals who hold any positions within that corporation, correct?
So I assuming that you mean can make decisions about the sale, purchase of the practice, any changes in the major changes on ownership, those kinds of decisions. Yes, I am the sole member. Obviously, I have a practice manager who I think you have met through previous depositions, who takes direct day-to-day dealings on many of our policy issues and on the actual runnings of the day-to-day business of the practice.
And I think you mentioned this before, but Orthopedic Center of Venice doesn't actually own the building that it operates in, correct?
That is correct.
You mentioned another corporation, Aragon.
Aragon PLLC. Yes, sir.
Who are the owners of that corporation?
Object to the form of the question.
My wife and I.
Does Orthopedic Center of Venice have a lease with Aragon?
Yes.
Is Orthopedic Center of Venice required to carry insurance under the lease?
No.
Okay. Does Orthopedic Center of Venice pay rent to Aragon under the lease?
Object to the
Yes.
form of the question.
I'm sorry. Yes.
And who are the other entities that share the building?
Gynecology of Venice.
Who is the owner of that entity?
My wife, Dr. Gina Arabit.
And does that company also have a lease with Aragon?
Yes.
Is that company required to carry insurance under the lease?
No. What can I?
You can't ask
Clarification.
questions today. No.
Okay. So I'm not sure what kind of. I'm sure what kind of insurance you're referring to.
Any type of insurance.
The bank. I don't know if the bank that mortgages Aragon PLLC requires that. I know that there is a business insurance that each of the practices has. So I don't know I don't think that that's technically terms of the lease, but I think the mortgage requires it.
That business insurance that you're referencing does not cover professional negligence, correct?
Specifically, it does not cover medical malpractice.
In October of 2015, did you have any other types of employment aside from your practice at Orthopedic Center of Venice?
Employment. October 2015. Yes, I was obviously I was a state representative, so I was under the employ of the state of Florida. I have a contractual relationship to see patients in the emergency room as part of my call agreements. Definitely at Venice Regional in 2015. I don't think at the other two hospitals at that time, but I don't think that was an employment agreement. That was a contractual agreement for services, consulting agreement.
Okay. How long had you been a state representative in October of 2015?
No, I would say about a year because well, wait, that doesn't make sense. I think I got elected in 2000, right, I got elected in 2014, so it would have had to have been about a year.
Okay. And what in general, if we can talk about October of 2015, what percentage of your time were you spending seeing patients at Orthopedic Center of Venice and the various hospitals compared to the percentage of time that you were spending doing legislative duties?
At that time, I was mostly full-time. I believe I was full-time. I cannot recall whether I was full-time to the letter of the law in October specifically. Maybe it would help if I give you the schedule on what it looks like. So the legislature, the Florida Constitution requires that the legislature meet for 60 consecutive days. Those 60 consecutive days can fall either in January through February, March, depending on the start time, or it can fall in March through April. So it never falls during October. There are some committee meetings that take place on the run-up. Usually in October, there may be 1 week where there's a committee week, but that usually takes me out of the practice 3 days out of that work week, such that I would probably see patients on that Monday or that Friday. So for October, I can definitively tell you that we were not in session, and I can maybe there. I don't recall when the committee weeks, if any, there were in that October. So I would say at least 80 to 90% of my time in October of 2015 was dedicated to being a physician. I would also tell you that most of the activities that I engaged in, when I was not in session or physically in Tallahassee, I did either during the lunch break, before the start of the office for breakfast meetings with individuals or groups, or I would do it at the end of the day, after hours.
Okay, so in October of 2015, you wouldn't have been traveling to Tallahassee?
I don't know if there was a committee week during that time, but it would certainly not have figured as being the major part of my time that I would have spent working during that month.
Okay, if I showed you the congressional schedule, would you be able to recall whether or not you were on a certain committee?
Well, I wasn't a member of Congress, so it was the State House.
The State House.
Okay, yes, I would be able, I don't recall what happened, but I would be able to tell you that overwhelmingly likely whether I was in Tallahassee on certain dates or not.
And I'm making an objection as to this whole line of questioning as being completely 100% irrelevant.
I'm showing you what has been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 1.
Again, I'm making an objection to this as being completely irrelevant. Lack of foundation, predicate.
Can you please take a look at this calendar and let me know whether you can tell by reviewing this calendar if you may have been in Tallahassee or not?
Well, assuming that this calendar is correct, because I don't know if this is a true calendar or not, but assuming this calendar is correct, which is entitled the interim calendar of the House of Representatives, week of October 5, 2015. So if this was correct, if this is a true calendar and a true reflection of what happened that week, then I would have been in Tallahassee October 6th, October 7th, and October 8th. I would have seen patients on Monday. I would have left at around 4 or 5 p.m., gotten to Tallahassee around 11 or midnight, then taken on my duties in the various committees, and then I would have returned on Thursday because, again, you have a meeting here. This plan, if this is the true record, says that that there was a Judiciary Committee meeting on October 8th in the morning. So I would have attended the Judiciary Committee meeting, which would have ended at around 11, right? Because it's according to the schedule, it would have been at 11. And then after that, I may have seen one or two people who wished to engage me as state representative, and then got in my car and traveled back home, arriving. Usually the time is maybe, for a schedule like this, I would usually get home around 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 that evening.
And you're aware that Dr. Ng with your office saw John Green on October 7th, correct?
Yes, sir.
October 7th, 2015.
Yes, sir.
And strike that. John Green was your patient at that time, correct?
Well, like in every practice that I have ever practiced in, whether it was Jewett Orthopedics, Baker Hurd, in my residency, it's the practice it's the patient of the practice. So we often have to, not often, but we not infrequently have to reallocate our assets and our individuals who are available to see patients. So I will say that the patient was a patient of the practice that I had previously taken care of. Dr. Ng had not met him yet.
Okay. If you were in the office on October 7th when John Green came in, would you have seen John Green?
If I was in the office, yes. But recall that a lot of times we're in the operating room. So for example, last week there were multiple cases where my partner, Dr. Ng, was in the operating room and I saw patients for her. So whether I was in Tallahassee or not doesn't necessarily reflect whether I would have been in the office that day.
What are your normal office hours? Strike that. In October of 2015, what were your normal office hours when you were actually at Orthopedic Center of Venice?
Well, it differs from day to day because there are times where where each of the doctors has surgery time and other times where we have office scheduled. So the practice is generally has one doctor available, or both doctors, but at least one doctor available from between the hours of 8:30. Our staff arrives at 8, and in 2015 would have been available until whenever we finish conducting the business of the day. But generally we aim, and we generally do complete the business of the day by 5. So we generally start seeing patients at 8:30, and then there's an afternoon session at 1:30. So usually the routine is that one doctor is in the office while the other doctor is in the operating room. Sometimes, and then it switches. Sometimes, and I can't recall our schedule for that time. You may, on a certain day of the week, you may have all-day surgery, be scheduled for all-day surgery, or you may be scheduled for all-day office. But essentially, the 30,000-foot view is where we see patients from 8:30 to about 5.
And if you can recall, in October of 2015, approximately how many patients were you seeing on the day when you were in the office?
I don't recall.
It would vary on a daily basis.
Yes, sir.
What's the most amount of patients that you normally see in a day?
In a day, the most I would see in this office is probably, and I'm talking about historically because there are other offices where I've seen different amounts because we were structured differently, but in this office historically I don't think that I've seen more than 40 patients in a day.
And how long was OCV a single physician office?
You're talking about Orthopedic Center of Venice?
Correct. And just for the record, I may say OCV, and I'm referring to Orthopedic Center of Venice.
I understand. I wanted to make sure that we were both talking about the same thing. From the day of its inception, which was, I think, in April 2004, to the day that Dr. Ng started practicing, OCV, Orthopedic Center of Venice, was a single physician practice.
And have any other physicians ever been employed by OCV aside from Dr. Ng?
No, sir.
Why did OCV decide to recruit an additional physician?
First, I had been trying for a number of years because we were at a market disadvantage. The groups around us were expanding, and I was still at one physician. Also, the patient load was expanding, and I wasn't going to be able to accommodate it regardless. Then when I became state representative, then it became important to also have a physician presence in the practice. When I first became state representative, all the orthopedic surgeons in the community graciously said that they would be happy to cover my patients while I was gone, and sometimes they did. I felt that that was an undue burden on somebody else's practice. So I thought that that was another reason why it was important for us to expand. But in point of fact, I had been feeling, or I had been recognizing the need to expand the practice for quite some time prior to 2015, 2014.
And were you involved in the physician recruitment process?
Yes, sir, I was.
How did you find Dr. Ng?
With the assistance of the hospital, Venice Regional Community Center.
Okay,
I think they were Venice Regional Community Center at the time. I think now they're Bayfront Health.
And to your knowledge, what was Venice Regional doing to try and recruit a physician?
They had a hired physician recruitment staff, and they used pretty much the same, I assume, I don't know, but you asked me my understanding. My understanding is that they used the same recruiting techniques that most private recruiting firms would use in searching for candidates throughout the country.
And Orthopedic Center of Venice entered into a physician recruitment agreement with Venice Regional, correct?
I asked them to, they did it. I don't know if there was a formal agreement, quote unquote, and I don't know if it was a real agreement, because I don't think that there was any exchange of consideration or anything like that, but I asked them and they did.
And tell me whether or not you know or not, but Dr. Ng was hired under a physician recruitment agreement, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know the general terms of the physician recruitment agreement?
Very general terms. It's a little while ago, but I can recite you some of the terms.
And before you do that, I don't want you to give me exact figures or numbers or anything like that. Just tell me the basics on how this physician recruitment agreement works.
The hospital found the doctor. The doctor agreed to work for my practice. The doctor's salary, Dr. Ng's salary was guaranteed for a year. And since you don't want to know figures, then we'll just get through that. But her salary was guaranteed by the hospital for a year. That guarantee was subtracted for whatever she brings into the practice. So as she brings money into the practice, the hospital, and her practice grows, the hospital is responsible for a lower and lower percentage. At the end of that year, then I, Orthopedic Center of Venice, would be solely responsible for whatever reimbursement agreement Dr. Ng would engage with the practice. But she continued to have a 2-year obligation to stay in the practice, or at least in the region, I think, and continue to practice in the area.
Doctor, if you need to take a break, now's probably a good time. We've been on the record for an hour. If you want to keep going, that's fine.
Whatever you like.
Oh, we can keep going. Doctor, I'm showing you what I've marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 2. Please take a moment and review this record. Please look up when you're ready.
Oh, okay.
Can you tell where this record is from, Doctor?
It appears to be from Venice Regional Medical Center, Bayfront Health. Venice Regional Bayfront Health.
And can you tell the date on which this medical record was at least dictated?
October 2nd, 2015.
And who is the doctor that dictated this record? Can you tell?
It appears that it is Sandra Hansen Anderson. And that correlates, well, Sandra Anderson is an ARNP, which is a registered nurse practitioner. So it was dictated by a nurse practitioner and appears to have been authenticated, which I assume means co-signed, by Dr. Thanjita on October 29th, 2015.
And if you could, please read for me we'll strike that. Before I ask that question, do you know where you were on October 2nd, 2015?
Object to the form of the question.
Unless you can show me a consult that I did on October 2nd, I don't know where I was.
All right. Could you read where it says history of present illness? Can you read down to the sentence that says that he would follow up with the patient in his office next week? You see that? About halfway down that paragraph.
I see Dr. Julio Gonzalez was notified.
Yes.
Is that the sentence you're talking about?
Yeah, if you can read up to and through the end of that sentence.
So it says, upon arrival to the emergency room, scans were obtained, which showed a fracture to the proximal humeral shaft. Dr. Julio Gonzalez was notified, comma, asked the patient to be placed in the splint, and that he would follow up with the patient in his office next week.
Okay. Do you recall ever seeing John Green on October 2nd, 2015?
No, when he was in the emergency room, which was on October 2nd, 2015, I did not see the patient.
Okay. Did you ever see an x-ray on October 2nd, 2015?
I cannot recall.
Okay. You can set that record aside for a second. I'm going to show you next what I'm marking as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 3. Take a look at that and let me know when you're ready.
Which page is that?
I'm ready.
Can you tell where this record is from, or where it appears to be from?
Venice Regional Bayfront Health.
And can you tell by looking at this record the date it was dictated?
October 3, 2015.
And can you tell who dictated this record?
Me.
Okay. I see date of consultation. It says 10/3/2015, consulting physician Julio Gonzalez, MD. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
And then it says reason for consultation, proximal humerus fracture, left upper extremity. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then in the section that says history of present illness, it says Mr. Green is a 75-year-old white male who fell as part of a non-syncopal fall yesterday, experiencing immediate onset of left shoulder pain and swelling. He presented to the emergency room where x-rays were obtained. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, sir.
He was diagnosed with a proximal humerus fracture of the left upper extremity. You see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and then it says, I was called. I recommended the patient be placed in a coaptation splint as it was described as more of a humeral shaft fracture than a proximal humerus fracture. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Does this refresh your recollection that you actually hadn't seen John Green on 10/2 and that you actually hadn't seen an x-ray on October 2nd?
Well, I admitted to you that I did not see him on October 2nd. What I couldn't recall was whether I had seen an x-ray on October 2nd. So, according to this, it would appear that I did not see an x-ray of him on October 2nd, but I fully recall that I did not see him in the emergency room on October 2nd.
Is it common for you to diagnose and treat patients without actually examining them or seeing any records?
It is not common for me to diagnose, and what was the other term?
Treat.
And treat patients. It is not common for me to try to diagnose and treat, nor did I diagnose or treat the patient on October 2nd.
And looking at Exhibit 3, at the time that you were called, the fracture was described to you as more of a humeral shaft fracture than a proximal humerus fracture. That's what this note says, right?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain to me what that means?
A humeral shaft fracture is a fracture that occurs at the mid portion of the humerus. A proximal humerus fracture, by the way, the humerus is the bone that makes up the upper arm, that area from your shoulder to the elbow. So, and it's a single long bone. That bone, if it breaks in the center portion, we call that the shaft, so that would be a humeral shaft fracture. If the fracture occurs higher up towards the shoulder region, it is a different algorithm and a different set of understandings on how we would treat those. So we would distinguish that by calling it a proximal humerus fracture or upper part. There are different types of both of these fractures. You can subclassify them, but essentially, to answer your question, that's the difference.
And was that description of the break incorrect?
Which description?
Well, it says it was described as more of a humeral shaft fracture than a proximal humerus fracture. Was that description incorrect?
There's two descriptions there.
Okay. It was described as more of a humeral shaft fracture. Was that incorrectly described?
No, I believe that the fracture, after seeing that x-ray on October 3rd, which is when I first treated and evaluated the patient, I felt that it was more of a shaft fracture than it was a proximal humerus fracture.
Then why did you write in your reason for consultation proximal humerus fracture?
Because that's what they called me and told me that it was when they called me on October 3rd. So let me clarify. When I got the emergency room doctor calls me and describes a certain fracture to him, I am not treating the patient there. I am not diagnosing the patient. I am relying on my colleague, who is supposed to have a certain minimum proficiency at taking care of emergency room patients, to give me the information that I need to guide him or her on the immediate stabilization, if you will, of that patient, so that that patient can then go to the office and see me for actual treatment and evaluation. When I got called on October 2nd, the fracture was described to me, according to this, the way this makes sense, is the fracture was described to me as a humeral shaft fracture. For a humeral shaft fracture, if it is closed, then I would usually recommend that he be placed in a coaptation splint, and then he can follow up with me in a week or in a few days, depending on so many factors, many of them social, many of them dealing with when the weekend's coming and things of that nature. If it was a proximal humerus fracture, then I would have treated that with a sling probably, or a sling and a swath. So the reason why the distinction would be important, as I'm dictating it, is because I want to explain to myself and to anybody who may be reviewing why I chose a coaptation splint as my advice to the physician over a sling. And that's why I mentioned that. Now, when they called me on October the 3rd, I don't recall, but the only way this sentence would make sense would be if, when they called me, the nurse said, "Hey, you have a consult for a proximal humerus fracture." And I probably went to the hospital to see the patient, Mr. Green, knowing that this was the patient that I had heard about the night before, wondering, wait, is it a proximal humerus fracture or is it a shaft fracture? So I think I was doing this to be specific in what the other teams were calling it and what I thought it was. In the end, I called it a proximal humerus fracture, simply because, if I recall, the fracture started at the proximal humerus and then went down into the shaft. So it was one in that area between the two. So I think just to keep things clear and for the purposes of lack of confusion, I just continued with the proximal humerus fracture diagnosis. But in point of fact, the fracture was such a long spiral that it started at, or it ended at the mid shaft, and it started at the proximal level of the humerus. You could have physicians call it either.
And you're aware that John Green was seen in your office on October 7th, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think that we have established that if that calendar, which we've marked as Exhibit 1, is correct, that you were in Tallahassee at the time that John Green was seen on October 7th, correct?
Yes, sir.
You understand that John Green was examined by Dr. Ng on that day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever speak to Dr. Ng about John Green on October 7th?
Yes.
Okay. What was the substance of your conversation?
I had received a text from her. Now, I cannot, and I'll preface my relation of the conversations to you by telling you that I honestly cannot recall where I was when I received the text and when I called her. I could have very well been in Tallahassee. I just simply don't recall, independently of my recollection of the information that what transpired between us two, where exactly I received that information. But nevertheless, I recall that Dr. Ng had sent me a text with a photograph of what she described as Mr. Green's fracture, and I can't recall what language she put next to the fracture. I can't recall what language she put next to the picture of the fracture. But nevertheless, as soon as I saw the text, or as soon as I became available following the text, I felt it important to call and find out what was going on. I called her, and I recalled paraphrasing the conversation. I remember the concepts that were exchanged. We viewed the fracture. She told me that something had happened to him in the interim days where the fracture changed from being minimally displaced, as was what I saw on October 3rd, to having it pointed, as shown in the picture of the X-rays that she took that day. And then I remember her telling me that the skin was intact, and I remember she used the word intact. Based on that information, she then told me that she had placed him in a. She used different words, but essentially they both mean a functional humeral brace or a clamshell brace, which is a brace where it straps onto the arm and sometimes encompasses the shoulder as well to try to line up the fracture in addition to the lining up effect that takes place by gravity. A lot of times gravity lines these fractures up nicely. But nevertheless, she had done that, and I thought that being that he was a number of days out, that it was appropriate to try to use that brace to better line up the fracture. And I told her that that I would see the patient, and I think that the term I used was next week. I'll just see him next week, because he had just been seen that day. And she felt comfortable with that, I felt comfortable with that, and I believe that was the extent of the conversation.
You mentioned that she sent you a photograph.
Yes, sir.
Was that via text message?
Yes, sir.
Okay. One photograph?
I don't recall.
Okay.
It was a photo. I remember a photograph. Whether she sent me one or two photographs, I don't know. By the way, the photographs were of X-rays only. But I don't remember if it was one or two photographs. But there was one photograph that stood in my mind as demonstrative of where we were, in the care of that patient.
I'm going to show you next what I have marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 4. I'll represent to you that these are text message records that we received from AT&T in response to a subpoena. And the subpoena was for the cell phone records of Dr. Ng. At the top, you'll see that it says AT&T has queried for records from 10/7/2015, 9 a.m. to 10/7/2015 at 11:59 p.m. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you could do me a favor and look at the column underneath that starts with terminating number. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Can you identify your cell phone number on in that column anywhere?
No, sir. I do not.
Can you identify your number anywhere in the originating number column?
No, I do not.
Do you know how many cell phones Dr. Ng has?
No, sir.
Okay. And Margie, I want to ask him this question just to see if when I go back and I look at the rest of the records, if I can identify what his number is. But do you feel comfortable telling me the first 3 digits of your phone number? And we can go off the record if you'd like.
Up to you. I mean,
I feel comfortable.
okay. Let's go off the record, though.
Off
Go off the record,
I'm
please.
going off the record. The time is 10:19 a.m.